For 22 years, Rosa Alvarez entered the Whitmore house through the kitchen door. She arrived before sunrise, tied the same white apron around her waist, prepared breakfast, packed lunches, washed clothes, remembered birthdays, cleaned scraped knees, and stayed awake beside sick children who were not her own. Then, on a Monday morning in November, the man whose children she had helped raise stood in that same kitchen and told her she had 30 minutes to leave. No retirement, no severance, not even a proper goodbye. At 61 years old, Rosa walked out carrying 2 grocery bags filled with everything she had accumulated during 22 years of work. Charles Whitmore believed he had removed a problem from his house. What he didn't know was that his mother had already begun documenting one. 3 months later, Eleanor Whitmore died. Her family gathered inside a lawyer's office, expecting to divide houses, investments, and an estate worth millions. Rosa wasn't supposed to be there. At least Charles didn't think she was. But the lawyer refused to begin until she arrived. When Rosa finally entered, Charles looked at her and asked the same question everyone else in the room was thinking. "What is she doing here?" The lawyer didn't answer. Instead, he placed a brown envelope on the table. Eleanor had sealed it 11 days before her death. Inside were 7 handwritten pages. The first was addressed to her children. The second spoke about her grandchildren. But near the end, Rosa's name appeared. And after the lawyer read what Eleanor had written, Charles stopped asking why the maid was in the room. He started asking what his mother had discovered before she died. Because Eleanor hadn't only left Rosa something. She had left behind 22 years of proof, and some of it concerned Charles himself. Before we discover what Eleanor had prepared, tell us where you're watching this story from today. Leave your city or country in the comments. It's incredible seeing how far one story can travel. Rosa Alvarez first entered the Whitmore house in the spring of 2003. She was 39. Her husband, Miguel, had died 18 months earlier after a construction accident. The insurance money covered the funeral, several months of rent, and almost nothing else. Rosa had one daughter, Sophia, who was 14. There was no inheritance, no savings worth mentioning, no college fund. There was a rented apartment in Queens, an aging Chevrolet with a transmission that slipped whenever it rained, and $1,840 in Rosa's bank account. She needed work. The Whitmore house needed someone reliable. That was how it began. Eleanor Whitmore was 62 then. Her husband had built a regional construction business that eventually became Whitmore Development Group. By the time he died, the family owned apartment buildings, warehouses, and commercial properties across New York and New Jersey. Eleanor could have hired an agency. She didn't. She interviewed Rosa personally at the kitchen table. The interview lasted 17 minutes. Eleanor asked about experience. Rosa told her she had worked in hotel housekeeping and later in a private home. Eleanor asked why she had left. "My husband died." Eleanor stopped writing. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." There was a pause. Then Eleanor asked something Rosa hadn't expected. "Do you have children?" "One daughter." "How old?" 14. "And what does she want to become?" Rosa smiled. "Depends on the week." Eleanor laughed. Rosa got the job. The arrangement was simple, Monday through Friday, 6:30 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. Cleaning, laundry, cooking, and occasional errands. The salary wasn't extraordinary, but it was steady. More importantly, Eleanor allowed Rosa to leave early whenever Sophia had a school event. "You have a daughter," Eleanor told her. "Your job should help you raise her, not prevent you from doing it." Rosa never forgot that sentence. Years later, when almost everything else inside the Whitmore family had become complicated, she would remember exactly who had said it. Eleanor's son Charles lived in the house too. Charles was 36, recently divorced and completely consumed by the family business. He had 2 children. Thomas was 8. Grace was 5. Their mother had moved to Connecticut after the divorce. The children stayed with Charles during the week and spent alternating weekends with her. At least that was the arrangement on paper. In practice, Charles was rarely home. He left before breakfast, returned after dinner, sometimes after midnight. He knew his children's school. He knew their birthdays. He knew the names of their teachers when someone reminded him. But Rosa knew everything else. Thomas hated tomatoes but liked tomato sauce. Grace couldn't sleep unless the hallway light remained on. Thomas pretended he wasn't afraid of thunderstorms. Grace actually wasn't. Thomas needed 20 minutes alone after losing a basketball game. Grace needed someone to listen immediately. Rosa learned those things because someone had to. She never tried to become their mother. She understood that boundary. But children don't measure love by job descriptions. They measure it by who shows up. When Thomas broke his wrist at 11, Rosa was the first adult the school reached. When Grace performed in her first school play, Rosa sat beside Eleanor in the third row. Charles arrived during the final applause. He apologized afterward. There had been a meeting. There was always a meeting. Eleanor watched him from across the lobby. You'll wake up one day and realize you know your buildings better than your children. Charles smiled. Everything I'm doing is for them. Eleanor had heard that sentence before. Her husband used to say it too. Rosa didn't know it then, but that sentence would follow Charles for the next 20 years. Everything I'm doing is for them. It would explain his absence. Later, it would explain something far worse. Years passed. Sophia graduated from high school. Rosa cried harder than anyone at the ceremony. She continued working for the Whitmores while Sophia attended community college and later trained as a nurse. Thomas became a teenager. Grace became one too. The Whitmore house changed slowly. The wallpaper disappeared. The old furniture was replaced. The kitchen was renovated twice. Charles bought the neighboring property and expanded the garden. But Rosa remained. So did Eleanor. By 2013, Rosa had worked there for 10 years. Charles gave her a small raise. Eleanor gave her something else. A key. Not the kitchen key Rosa already carried, the front door key. Rosa looked at it. I already have a key. That one is for employees. Eleanor placed the new key in Rosa's hand. This one is for family. Rosa tried to refuse. Eleanor closed Rosa's fingers around it. Take the key. Rosa did. She kept it for the next 12 years. At the time, it was only a key. Later, it would become the most important object Eleanor ever gave her. There were signs even then that Charles saw the house differently from his mother. To Eleanor, wealth was something the family happened to possess. To Charles, wealth was evidence that he had won. He expanded Whitmore development aggressively. He borrowed, bought, renovated, sold, borrowed again. By 45, Charles was appearing in business magazines. By 50, his company controlled more than $180 million in property. People began calling him self-made. Rosa always found that strange. Not because Charles hadn't worked. He had. But Rosa remembered the company before Charles ran it. She remembered Eleanor's husband. She remembered the inherited buildings. She remembered Eleanor guaranteeing Charles's first major loan. Self-made was a convenient phrase. It removed everyone who had helped. Charles became very good at removing people from the picture. At first, Rosa barely noticed. He stopped eating breakfast in the kitchen. Then he stopped eating at home. He replaced the family accountant, then the family attorney, then several executives who had worked with his father. Modernization, Charles called it. Eleanor called it something else. Erasing witnesses. Charles laughed when she said it. Eleanor didn't. One afternoon, Rosa was carrying clean towels past Eleanor's study when she heard a conversation. Charles was inside. I moved the Newark property into the holding company. Eleanor answered immediately. Why? Tax efficiency. You didn't ask me. We discussed it. No, you discussed it. There was a pause. Then Charles said, It's still ours. Eleanor's answer came quietly. That's not what I asked. Rosa kept walking. At the time, she thought it was another argument about business. Years later, she would remember every word. By 2018, Eleanor was 77. Her health had begun to decline. Nothing dramatic. Arthritis, high blood pressure, occasional dizziness. Rosa began spending more time with her. Doctor appointments weren't technically part of Rosa's job. Neither was organizing medication. Neither was sitting beside Eleanor when she couldn't sleep. Rosa did those things anyway. One evening after returning from a cardiologist, Eleanor asked Rosa to sit at the kitchen table. She placed 2 cups of tea between them. Charles increased your salary? Last year? How much? Rosa told her. Eleanor's expression changed. That's all? It's enough. That wasn't my question. Rosa smiled. It's fine. Eleanor didn't. The following morning, Eleanor called payroll herself. Rosa's salary increased almost 30%. Charles noticed immediately. Rosa heard part of the argument from the hallway. She's an employee, mother. She's been here 15 years. Exactly. And she's been paid for 15 years. Not for everything she's done. Then give her a Christmas bonus. Eleanor hung up. Rosa pretended she hadn't heard. But something changed after that. Not between Rosa and Eleanor. Between Rosa and Charles. It started small. Charles stopped asking how Sophia was doing. He began checking what time Rosa arrived. He questioned grocery receipts. Once, he asked why Rosa had purchased a $14 bottle of olive oil instead of the $9 one. Rosa explained that Eleanor preferred it. Charles stared at the receipt. Use the cheaper one. Eleanor overheard. No. Charles looked at his mother. It's olive oil. Exactly. So why are you arguing about $5? Charles left. Rosa said nothing. Eleanor watched him go. People reveal themselves in small amounts first, she said. Rosa smiled. At the time, she thought Eleanor was talking about olive oil. She wasn't. Thomas left for college. Grace followed 3 years later. The house became quieter. Charles moved into a penthouse in Manhattan, but kept the family house as his official residence. Eleanor remained. So did Rosa. Without the children, Rosa's work changed. She became less of a housekeeper and more of Eleanor's companion. They ate lunch together, watched old movies, argued about television. Eleanor hated reality shows. Rosa loved them. Eleanor pretended not to watch, then asked questions about the contestants. Some afternoons, they sat in the garden without speaking. Rosa had spent so many years caring for other people that silence had become a luxury. Then, in February 2024, Eleanor fell. Rosa found her beside the stairs. The ambulance arrived 8 minutes later. Charles arrived at the hospital 4 hours later. The diagnosis was a fractured hip. Surgery went well. Recovery would not. Eleanor needed assistance almost constantly. Charles suggested a private nursing facility. Eleanor refused. I have a home. You need professional care. I have Rosa. Charles looked at Rosa. Rosa looked at Eleanor. I can help. Charles sighed. You're not a nurse. My daughter is. That was how Sophia returned to the Whitmore story. She was 35 now. Married, 1 child, registered nurse at a hospital in Queens. Sophia couldn't provide full-time care, but she helped Rosa understand medication schedules, mobility exercises, and warning signs. For 6 months, Rosa reorganized her life around Eleanor. She arrived earlier, stayed later, sometimes slept in the guest room. Eleanor improved slowly. By September, She could walk through the garden with a cane. One afternoon, Eleanor stopped beside the hydrangeas. You know what frightens me? Rosa assumed she meant falling again. It wasn't. Leaving things unfinished. Rosa looked at her. What things? Eleanor didn't answer. Instead, she asked a strange question. If someone gives you something important, Rosa, do you keep records? What kind of something? Anything. I suppose. Good. 3 days later, Eleanor asked Sophia to recommend an attorney. Not the Whitmore attorney. Someone independent. Sophia knew one through the hospital's patient advocacy program. His name was David Kaplan, 63, estate law, small office in Brooklyn, no connection to Whitmore Development. Eleanor met him privately. Rosa drove her there. She waited in the lobby for 90 minutes. When Eleanor emerged, she looked exhausted, but relieved. Everything okay? For the first time in a while. Rosa didn't ask more. What Rosa didn't know was that Eleanor had brought 3 folders into that meeting. One contained property records, one contained bank statements, and the third contained documents bearing Eleanor's signature that she didn't remember signing. Charles discovered the meeting 11 days later. Rosa never learned how. On November 4th, 2024, he entered the kitchen shortly after 8 in the morning. Eleanor was upstairs. Rosa was preparing oatmeal. Charles placed his phone on the counter. Did you take my mother to Brooklyn? Rosa turned off the stove. Yes. To an attorney? She asked me to drive. What attorney? You should ask your mother. I'm asking you. And I'm telling you to ask your mother. Charles stared at her. For the first time in 22 years, Rosa felt the room change. There was no Thomas, no Grace, no Christmas dinners, no hospital visits, no front door key. There was an employer and an employee. You're getting too involved. I drive your mother where she asks me to drive. You're paid to take care of this house. I'm paid to help your mother. No, you're paid by me. Technically, Charles was right. Whitmore Development's household account issued Rosa's paycheck. Charles controlled it. He continued, whatever my mother discussed with that lawyer is family business. I didn't enter the meeting. You arranged it. Sophia gave her a number. So now your daughter is involved too. No. Charles picked up his phone. You're done. Rosa thought she had misunderstood. What? Your employment ends today. She stared at him. Charles, I'll have payroll send whatever you're owed. Your mother needs... I'll hire someone qualified. Rosa didn't move. 22 years. She had entered that house at 39. She was leaving at 61. Charles looked at his watch. I have a call at 9. That was the end of the conversation. Rosa went upstairs. Eleanor sat beside the bedroom window. One look at Rosa's face, and she understood. He fired you. Rosa nodded. Eleanor reached for her cane. Get me my phone? No. Rosa. No. For 22 years, I have watched you fight everyone else's battles. Rosa crouched beside her chair. Don't fight this one. He can't do this. He already did. I'll call the board. And then what? Eleanor stopped. You need peace. I need you. Those 3 words almost broke Rosa. She took Eleanor's hands. You have my number. That's not the same. No. It wasn't. Rosa packed quietly. 2 grocery bags, a cardigan, an extra pair of shoes, 3 photographs Grace had given her, a coffee mug Thomas bought her when he was 16, a small sewing kit, and the front door key. She almost left the key on the kitchen counter. Instead, she carried it upstairs. Eleanor looked at it. No. It's your house. I gave it to you. Charles doesn't want me here. I do. Rosa placed it in Eleanor's palm. Eleanor closed Rosa's fingers around it again, exactly as she had 12 years earlier. "Keep the key." Rosa did. She walked out through the front door. Not the kitchen? For the first time in 22 years, Charles didn't watch her leave. The following morning, Rosa woke at 5:12. Her body still expected work. She made coffee, then remembered there was nowhere to go. Her apartment was quiet. Sophia called at 7. "Mama, come stay with us." "No. At least for a few days." "I'm fine." "You've worked since I was a child. You don't know how to be fine without working." Rosa almost laughed. Sophia was right. At 61, Rosa owned very little, but she wasn't destitute. Years of careful saving had given her $38,500, not enough to retire, enough to breathe. Charles's payroll department sent her final payment 4 days later. No severance, no retirement contribution. Beyond the small plan Rosa had funded herself. 22 years summarized in a direct deposit. $1,183.47. Rosa stared at the number, then closed the banking app. She didn't call Charles. She called Eleanor. No answer. She tried that evening. Nothing. Again the next morning. Nothing. On the fourth day, an unfamiliar woman picked up. "Whitmore residence?" Rosa knew immediately. The replacement. "My name is Rosa. May I speak with Mrs. Whitmore?" "Mr." Whitmore asked that all calls be screened. "I'm a friend." There was a pause. "I'll leave a message." Nobody called back. Rosa tried Charles. Voicemail. She tried Grace. Grace answered from Boston. "Rosa." The surprise in her voice hurt. "Have you spoken with your grandmother?" "Last weekend." "Why?" Rosa explained. Grace went quiet. "Dad fired you?" "Yes." "Why?" "I don't know." Grace did, or at least she knew Charles's version. He had told both children that Rosa was interfering with Eleanor's finances. He said Eleanor was vulnerable. He said boundaries had become necessary. Grace didn't believe him. Thomas wasn't sure. That uncertainty hurt Rosa more than she expected. She had helped raise him, but Charles was his father. Blood has a way of making obvious things complicated. 2 weeks passed. Then David Kaplan called. "Mrs. Alvarez?" "Yes." "I represent Eleanor Whitmore." Rosa sat down. "Is she okay?" "She's asking to see you." Charles had restricted visitors at the house, but he couldn't legally prevent Eleanor from meeting people elsewhere. David arranged it. December 2nd, 11 in the morning, his office. Rosa arrived first. Eleanor arrived 20 minutes later in a wheelchair. Sophia had arranged medical transportation. When Rosa saw her, she stopped breathing for a moment. Eleanor looked smaller, older, angrier. Rosa hugged her. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Eleanor said, "Sit down. We have work to do." On David's desk were folders, bank statements, property records, company documents. Rosa looked at them. "What is this?" Eleanor answered. "My son thinks I'm dying." Rosa didn't know what to say. He may be right, but he made the mistake of thinking dying and being stupid are the same thing. David almost smiled. Then Eleanor explained. For nearly 2 years she had noticed irregularities. Not theft in the obvious sense. Something more sophisticated. Properties personally owned by Eleanor were being transferred into corporate entities. Management fees were being charged. Ownership percentages were changing. Trust documents had been amended. Charles always had explanations. Tax planning, liability, protection, estate efficiency. Eleanor had signed some documents. Others contained electronic signatures she didn't remember authorizing. "Why didn't you confront him?" Rosa asked. "Because I wanted to know how much he'd done." David opened the first folder. a brownstone in Brooklyn, purchased by Eleanor and her husband in 1987, transferred into a Whitmore holding company. Another property in Newark, same pattern. A warehouse in Yonkers, same. 3 investment accounts had also been moved, not stolen, repositioned, legally complicated enough that recovering them would require proof Eleanor hadn't knowingly approved everything. Rosa felt sick. Charles did this? Eleanor stared at the papers. My son convinced himself that everything would belong to him eventually. That sentence stayed in the room. Eventually. That was the word. Charles wasn't stealing from a stranger. He was taking early possession of an inheritance he already considered his. But that still wasn't the reason Rosa had been fired. David opened another folder. Inside were emails. One was from Charles to the family accountant, another to a corporate attorney. A third contained a phrase Rosa immediately recognized. Mothers becoming increasingly dependent on staff. We need to reduce outside influence. Outside influence. Rosa. He hadn't fired her because she was interfering. He had fired her because she was a witness. Someone who knew Eleanor was mentally alert. Someone who had driven her to an independent attorney. Someone Charles couldn't control. What do you need from me? Rosa asked. Eleanor looked at her. Nothing. Then why tell me? Because after I'm gone, they'll say I was confused. David slid a small recorder across the table. Eleanor had begun documenting conversations. She had also completed 2 independent cognitive evaluations. Both showed full mental capacity. You planned all this? Rosa asked. Eleanor answered. I learned from Charles. For the next month, Rosa visited Eleanor secretly 3 times. Not at the house. Once at David's office, once at a medical clinic, once at Sophia's apartment. That final visit became the one Rosa remembered most. Sophia prepared lunch. Eleanor ate arroz con pollo at the small kitchen table, while Rosa's 6-year-old grandson showed her plastic dinosaurs. For 2 hours, Eleanor Whitmore wasn't a millionaire. She wasn't an estate. She wasn't someone's future inheritance. She was an 83-year-old woman laughing because a plastic Tyrannosaurus apparently needed rice. Before leaving, Eleanor looked around Sophia's apartment. Rosa. Yes? You did well. Rosa assumed she meant lunch. Eleanor shook her head. With her. She nodded toward Sophia. Rosa understood. You did too. Eleanor looked away. No, I outsourced too much. Charles had inherited more than buildings from his father. He had inherited absence. The difference was that Eleanor had lived long enough to recognize it. On January 17th, Eleanor was hospitalized. Heart failure. Grace flew from Boston. Thomas came from Chicago. Charles was already there. Rosa learned through Grace. She went to the hospital. Charles met her in the corridor. No. Rosa stopped. I'm here to see Eleanor. She's resting. Then I'll wait. Rosa, go home. Grace stood behind him. Dad, stay out of this. No. Grace walked past him and hugged Rosa. You came. Charles looked from his daughter to Rosa. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Rosa said nothing. Charles lowered his voice. My mother is extremely ill. I will not have people upsetting her. Then a voice came from inside the room. Weak, but unmistakable. Charles. Everyone stopped. Let her in. Rosa entered. Eleanor looked tiny beneath the blankets. Machines surrounded her. Rosa sat beside the bed. For 10 minutes, neither woman discussed money, or documents, or Charles. Eleanor asked about Sophia, then the grandson, then Thomas and Grace when they were children. Do you remember when Thomas tried to run away? Rosa smiled. He packed 2 cookies and 1 sock. No pants. He said pants were heavy? Eleanor laughed. It became a cough. Rosa held her hand. Charles watched from the doorway. Something about his expression changed. For a moment, he wasn't angry. He was outside. Outside a history he hadn't been present enough to share. Then Eleanor looked at him. Charles. He stepped closer. Yes? Don't become your father. Charles froze. Eleanor closed her eyes. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. Eleanor died 9 days later. January 26th, 4:18 in the morning. Grace called Rosa before sunrise. The funeral was private. Rosa sat near the back. Charles sat in front. Thomas and Grace beside him. People from Whitmore Development filled several rows. Executives, attorneys, developers, politicians. People Rosa had served dinner to for 20 years. Some recognized her. Most didn't. After the service, David Kaplan approached Charles. The estate reading is Friday. Charles nodded. My attorney will be there. Good. David looked toward Rosa. Mrs. Alvarez will need to attend as well. Charles followed his eyes. His face hardened. Why? David didn't answer. Friday arrived. 10 people sat around the conference table. Charles, Thomas, Grace, Charles's attorney, 2 representatives from Whitmore Development, David, another estate attorney, an accountant, and Rosa. Charles looked at her empty hands. No briefcase, no attorney, no expensive clothes. Just Rosa, the maid. What is she doing here? David placed a brown envelope on the table. Your mother requested her presence. Charles leaned back. This should be interesting. It was. Eleanor's estate was substantial, but not as substantial as Charles expected. Several properties were placed in trusts for Thomas and Grace. A charitable foundation received another portion. Personal belongings were divided. Grace received Eleanor's jewelry. Thomas received his grandfather's watch collection. Charles received ownership interests in several remaining family companies. Then David stopped. There is an additional document. Charles's attorney leaned forward. David opened the brown envelope. Inside were 7 handwritten pages. Eleanor's letter. My children and grandchildren, if you are hearing this, then I have finally done the one thing none of you believed I would ever do. I have stopped giving instructions. Grace laughed through tears. Even Thomas smiled. Charles didn't. The letter continued. Eleanor wrote about her husband, about the company, about mistakes, about money. Then David reached page 4. My greatest regret is that our family became very skilled at calculating the value of property and very poor at recognizing the value of people. Charles shifted in his chair. I watched my husband measure love through provision. I watched my son learn the same habit. I participated by allowing it. David continued. Thomas and Grace were fortunate. During the years when their father was building a company, someone else remembered the things companies cannot remember. Rosa lowered her eyes. Someone remembered lunches, medicine, school performances, broken hearts, favorite meals, and birthdays. Grace was crying now. Thomas stared at the table. That person was Rosa Alvarez. Nobody moved. Charles's attorney began writing. David kept reading. Rosa was paid for cleaning my house. She was not paid for becoming part of it. Charles exhaled sharply. Mother. David looked up. Charles stopped. I therefore leave Rosa Alvarez the cottage property at 18 Willow Lane, including the land and all contents, free of debt. Rosa stared at David. Willow Lane, Eleanor's cottage in Westchester. Estimated value, $640,000. Rosa shook her head immediately. No. David stopped. No. Charles actually laughed. You can't refuse before he's finished. Rosa looked at him. I don't want her house. David spoke gently. Mrs. Alvarez, there's more. There was. I know Rosa will attempt to refuse this gift. David, please tell her I anticipated that. Despite herself, Rosa almost smiled. The cottage is not payment for 22 years. Payment is owed. A gift is chosen. I choose this. Rosa covered her mouth. But David didn't close the letter, and that was the moment Charles's attorney stopped taking notes. Because the house wasn't the real surprise. David turned to the final page. And to my son Charles, if you are angry about this, ask yourself why a house given to Rosa feels more offensive to you than 22 years taken from her. Charles's face changed. Then David read the sentence Eleanor had written beneath it. My remaining personal assets cannot be distributed until the ownership dispute involving Whitmore Holdings is resolved. Charles stopped breathing. His attorney looked up. David placed the letter down, then opened another folder. What ownership dispute? Charles asked. David looked directly at him. The transfers your mother challenged 6 weeks before her death. Charles's attorney reached for the documents. David didn't hand them over. Copies have already been filed. Filed where? Surrogate's court, and with outside counsel representing the estate. Charles's voice sharpened. My mother approved those transfers. That's what will determine. She signed them. Some. All of them. David opened another folder. Then you'll have no problem explaining this. A cognitive evaluation, dated September. Another dated December. Both declared Eleanor fully competent. Then emails, recorded conversations, property records, and one document Charles hadn't expected, a statement from Rosa, not accusing him, not speculating, simply documenting dates. The day Eleanor requested the independent lawyer, the day Charles discovered the meeting, the day Rosa was fired, the blocked calls, the hospital confrontation, small facts. Individually, none proved much. Together, they formed a pattern. Charles stared at Rosa. You've been working against me. Rosa finally spoke. No. You met with lawyers behind my back. Your mother met with lawyers. You helped her. I drove her. You expect me to believe that's all? Rosa looked at him for several seconds. Then she said something Charles would remember long after the estate dispute ended. For 22 years, Charles, you believed the person carrying the tray couldn't hear the conversation. Silence. You talked in front of me because you didn't think I mattered. Charles said nothing. I heard you promise Thomas you'd attend his games. Thomas looked up. I heard you tell Grace you'd be home for her birthday. Grace wiped her eyes. I heard your mother ask you to slow down. Rosa's voice remained calm. And I heard you say everything you did was for your family. Charles looked away. Now you're saying the same thing about her money? Charles stood. His attorney touched his arm. Sit down. He didn't. David closed the folder. Mr. Whitmore, this meeting is over. But the story wasn't. In fact, that meeting only opened the next problem. Because once Eleanor's challenge became official, people who had remained silent began looking at documents they hadn't looked at in years. The inheritance wasn't resolved that day. Real consequences rarely arrive that neatly. It took 11 months. Accountants reviewed transfers. Attorneys exchanged documents. Former employees were interviewed. Electronic signatures were examined. And once people realized questions were being asked, more people began talking. The former family accountant, an executive Charles had fired, Eleanor's financial advisor, a notary. Nobody possessed the entire story. Each possessed a piece. That was enough. 3 property transfers were reversed. 2 were upheld. Several management fees were returned to the estate. Charles wasn't arrested. There was no dramatic raid, no handcuffs, no television cameras. What happened was quieter, and for Charles, probably worse. Whitmore Development's board opened an internal governance review. Banks became cautious. Partners requested additional signatures. Investors began asking questions. Charles had spent 20 years building the image of a man who controlled everything. Then everyone discovered how much of that control depended on nobody looking too closely. He remained wealthy. But wealth wasn't what he lost. Trust was. Thomas resigned from Whitmore Development 6 months later. He had joined after college because Charles expected him to. For the first time, Thomas made a decision his father hadn't approved. Grace stopped allowing Charles to use money as an apology. When he missed her daughter's birthday and sent an expensive gift, Grace returned it. Then she sent 4 words. She wanted her grandfather. Charles didn't reply. For the first time, there was no business explanation large enough to protect him. Rosa moved into the Willow Lane cottage in April. At first, she hated it. Not the house, what it represented. Every room reminded her Eleanor was gone. For 3 weeks, half the boxes remained unopened. Then Sophia came over one Saturday. She walked through the kitchen. Large windows, old stove, long wooden table. You know what this place needs? Nothing. People. Rosa looked at her. Sophia opened Eleanor's pantry. Inside were dishes, serving trays, old cookware. Then she found a folder. Rosa recognized Eleanor's handwriting immediately. On the front, for Rosa. When she stops being stubborn. Rosa laughed and cried at the same time. Inside wasn't money. It was a business plan. Simple. Eleanor had written it after hearing Rosa complain for years that elderly people living alone often ate badly. Rosa had always cooked extra meals for neighbors, church members, and people recovering from surgery. Eleanor had noticed. The plan was for a small community meal service. Nothing enormous. No franchise. No empire. A kitchen. Weekly meals. Affordable prices. Delivery to elderly residents. At the bottom, Eleanor had written, "You've spent your life feeding families. Perhaps now you can build something that belongs to yours." Rosa stared at the sentence for a long time. Then she called Sophia. 6 weeks later, they served their first 23 customers. Rosa cooked. Sophia handled health requirements and scheduling. Grace designed a simple website for free. Thomas paid for the first delivery van. Rosa tried to refuse. Thomas wouldn't let her. Consider it 22 years of unpaid birthday reminders. She accepted. They named the service Eleanor's Table, not Whitmore. Eleanor. The first month, they served 23 customers. The second month, 37. By the 5th month, 68. By Christmas, they were preparing 140 meals a week. The numbers didn't explode. They climbed. Slowly. Consistently. Rosa liked it that way. Eleanor's Table wasn't becoming an empire. It was becoming useful, and for Rosa, that mattered more. Then, almost 1 year after Eleanor died, Charles Whitmore drove to Willow Lane. Alone. No lawyer. No assistant. No expensive gift. Rosa saw him through the kitchen window. For several seconds, she considered not opening the door. Then she remembered Eleanor's sentence. People reveal themselves in small amounts first. Perhaps they changed the same way. Rosa opened the door. Charles looked older. Not poor. Not destroyed. Just tired. "Can I come in?" Rosa stepped aside. He entered. He looked around the cottage his mother had given away. He didn't mention its value. That was progress. On the kitchen wall hung photographs. Eleanor, Sophia, Grace, Thomas, Rosa's grandson. One photograph showed Thomas at 9 years old, asleep at the kitchen table while Rosa sat beside him. Charles stared at it. I don't remember that. You were in Chicago? He nodded. Another photograph showed Grace's school play. Charles wasn't in that one either. He looked at Rosa. Was I really that bad? Rosa thought before answering. You weren't cruel to them. That's not what I asked. No. Charles sat at the wooden table. For the first time in all the years Rosa had known him, he didn't defend himself. He didn't mention work, sacrifice, responsibility. He simply sat. My mother knew. Yes. For how long? Probably longer than either of us. Charles looked toward the window. I thought she was trying to punish me. Maybe she was trying to stop you. From what? Rosa sat across from him, becoming someone who only understands value after losing something. Charles's eyes filled. He looked away. Rosa didn't comfort him. Some moments shouldn't be rescued too quickly. After a while, Charles reached into his coat. Rosa tensed. He pulled out an old brass key, the front door key, the one Eleanor had given Rosa years earlier. I found this in Mother's bedroom. Rosa stared at it. Eleanor must have had a copy made. Charles placed it on the table. I think she wanted you to have it. Rosa picked it up. Then Charles said something she never expected. I'm selling the house. The Whitmore house? He nodded. Thomas doesn't want it. Grace doesn't want it. I don't want to live there. Rosa looked at the key. Then why give me this? Charles looked around the cottage. Because I think I've finally understood something. Rosa waited. The key was never about the house. For once, Charles Whitmore was right. Rosa kept the key. She never used it again. 2 years after Eleanor's death, Eleanor's table served more than 400 meals each week. Rosa hired 6 employees. 3 were women over 50 who had struggled to find stable work. 1 was a widower who delivered meals. Another was a former restaurant cook recovering from bankruptcy. Rosa didn't build an empire. She didn't want one. She built a table large enough for more people. Thomas visited often. Grace brought her children whenever she was in New York. Charles came occasionally. At first, he always called before arriving. Eventually, Rosa told him he didn't have to. One Sunday afternoon, Rosa stood in the kitchen preparing chicken, while Charles sat at the long wooden table helping his granddaughter with homework. He wasn't checking his phone. There was no assistant waiting. No meeting. No building. Just a grandfather trying to understand 4th grade fractions. Rosa watched him struggle for several minutes. Then she smiled. Eleanor would have enjoyed that. And perhaps that was the final thing Charles had needed to learn. For most of his life, he believed value could be measured: square footage, property, revenue, ownership, documents. His mother had spent her final months trying to show him something he couldn't place on a balance sheet. Rosa had entered the Whitmore house through the kitchen door for 22 years. She cooked, cleaned, remembered, listened, raised children who weren't hers, sat beside an old woman who was afraid of leaving things unfinished. On paper, Rosa had been an employee. That was all Charles saw. But paper had always been Charles's problem. It could show who owned the house. It could show who controlled the company. It could show where money moved. What it could not show was who stayed, who remembered, who showed up, who mattered. And that was the mistake Eleanor spent her final months correcting. Not because Rosa needed to become rich. Not because Charles needed to become poor. Neither happened. Rosa received a house and built something meaningful. Charles remained wealthy. The real reversal was simpler. The woman everyone treated like staff turned out to be one of the people holding the family together. And the man who believed he owned everything discovered that ownership and belonging were never the same thing. Dear listener, if you've stayed with this story until now, Maybe some part of Rosa's life reminded you of someone. A mother, a grandmother, a caregiver, a worker, someone who spent years doing things everyone depended on, while almost nobody stopped to ask what that work was worth. Some of the most important people in a family never appear on the documents that seem important. Their names aren't on the business. They don't own the house. They don't control the bank account. But remove them, and suddenly everyone discovers how much they were carrying. Eleanor understood that before Charles did. Maybe that's why she didn't simply leave Rosa money. She left her a place, a key, a chance to build something of her own. And one final lesson for the son who spent his life believing providing for people was the same thing as being present for them. If you were Rosa, would you have allowed Charles back into your life after everything he did? Or would you have closed the door and left him with the consequences? Tell us honestly in the comments. This is one of those questions where people will probably disagree. And if you've ever known someone whose work was invisible until they stopped doing it, tell us about them too. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe so we can meet again in another story worth telling. Until next time.